Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I'll get it started by talking about this survival kit for journalists of color. Hey. This is a project by 3 Jonas Knight Journalism Fellows. We were in last year's class, and the way the fellowship goes is that we come into the program and we have our own sort of journalistic challenges that we pitch into the program. But a lot of times, just having wonderful colleagues around you and you're talking deeply about, the research that you're doing or things that you're running into in journalism, and you just kind of, fun ideas start to bubble. And so this is one of those things that kind of took off as a result of having really great conversations. So I'm gonna tell that story. So, and just to give you a little bit of background about my journalism challenge. So, I'm from Los Angeles, I'm from Inglewood. I've been working in journalism for quite some time. I spent the first half of my journalism career as a print designer. And then in, I want to say 2012, I transitioned into digital media. So I learned how to code, and I got my first coding job at the San Francisco Chronicle, where I became a lead digital designer. And then I went on to the Star Tribune as senior digital designer. Spent 2 years there, and then I came back to San Francisco as a creative director. And also, I run a number of programs. So I launched the HBCU task force at NABJ. I attended Grambling State University in Louisiana. And I also run the ONA HBCU Digital Media Fellowship. And that's just to basically bring HBCU students to one of the premier digital media conferences and expose them to what's happening in the industry, and they can kind of get immersed and start to figure out how to direct their career. So my fellowship question asks, how might we create the conditions for journalists of color to produce digital storytelling? And that's it's an industry problem, not limited to just journalists of color. We really need more people being equipped with digital journalism skills. But in my research, I noticed that oftentimes I would refer to the conditions for journalists of color to just do their job, right? Part of it was okay, I understand that we need to create people who would think about digital media, but there are a lot of roadblocks that get in the way of the ability to then move forward into digital media and storytelling. So I started to ask what gets in the way. And I want you to meet Sima Yasmin. She was kind of listening to how I was talking about these things. Sima is one of my fellows from my cohort. And she just kind of listened and heard, and she's like, yo, well, why don't we create, something that reduces the barrier? Why don't we, figure out how we can remove some of those roadblocks in the experience of the career, and that might be a great way to, move people of color ahead. So we had this conversation, and we asked what could be done about the shared experience of racism, sexism, and xenophobia in newsrooms. We talked about it, and we talked about in-the-moment responses for everyday racist microaggressions and exercises that help journalists of color build community and recruit allies in the newsroom. The Toolkit for Journalists of Color is designed to help us survive in predominantly white newsrooms. The Toolkit is one part of our survival kit for journalists of color. So it's one part because there's another fellow named Jennifer Dargan, and she was doing some very interesting work. Jennifer Dargan had been researching privilege and bias in newsrooms as part of her fellowship project. And when she heard what Sima and I were working on, we started collaborating. Excuse me. She suggested the idea of a companion deck. Excuse me. She suggested the idea of a companion deck to help white journalists understand how their words and actions can contribute to newsrooms where JOC, so that journalists of color can survive. What we were working toward is journalists of color thriving in newsrooms, and Jennifer's deck will help white journalists do some of the self-work that is needed to have more equality. So what is this toolkit exactly? It's a toolkit for journalists of color and a companion deck. And, oh, I have a typo. It's a framework for conversations. So I want to tell you a little bit about what went into developing this framework before I show you what it is. One of the really cool things that is happening right now in the design world that journalism is catching on to is hypothesis-driven design. And that is, you have a hypothesis around an idea, and then you throw it through this system for evaluating the idea. So I'm just going to kind of walk you through this process. It's one thing to kind of see the structure. Can you see that? Little red dot. Okay. So it begins with research. And then you develop a plan for how you want to attack. So this is after your hypothesis is formed. You do a little bit of research, do some planning about how it should work. And then you enter this phase. It's the prototype phase. So you sketch out the concept, you can present it, have some critique, and you can continue to do this process for a little while. Then you roll into the development process. So you test it. Well, actually, you build it first, and then you test it. And then you observe like what happened. So what did you learn out of that test? Is there something that needs to be repaired? And then you go to launch, and then you review and do it over again. So our research process included interviews. And we set up stations and asked friends. So Sima and I set up stations at the JSK lab. And those stations were a place where we could collect stories from journalists of color who were in our fellowship program. And then we opened that call to share your stories and experiences to the larger journalism program at Stanford. So, and then we also asked our friends about some of their newsroom experiences. That research was also kind of locked in with Jennifer's research, which was great. So she was already learning about bias, and she was kind of collecting tips and tools from people who specialize in bias and trying to understand, like, how do you develop a framework for that? And so once we collected enough responses, we then opened it to a wider audience to get feedback about what we were trying to solve. So we opened up a form, and we allowed people to kind of like read an experience and then see if they had a similar experience. And then from there, we developed the two card decks. So just to use an example, we try to break these into categories in which to like place the problem that we heard. So this is missing representation, and this was a quote that we heard in the responses that we got. Newsrooms are good at hiring people of color, but not good at retaining them. I think the biggest feature about the cards is really centered around the framework here. So understanding the issue at hand. We created these sorts of labels that, ask a little bit or dig into the problem. So why is this a problem? We wanted to kind of break down what's happening in a certain situation. So just to take a step back, a lot of times in the experience, you'll have someone who heard something that really was jarring, for instance, and they might clam up in the moment. So they don't get a chance to be heard about what actually hurt them. But in this situation, we'll just break down this particular problem. So why is this a problem? This speaks to an issue in the newsroom and newsroom culture. It means the newsroom is not a healthy place for people of color to work and to thrive. The culture was not designed with people of color in mind. And then we offer up some tips. Build a community with journalists of color in the newsroom, if there are any, and share ideas about how to cope with the newsroom environment and culture. So you can see that we're giving people some steps in which they can take to start to address the issue that they're feeling with the problem. And then some of them are actionable too, like asking. So who is in the newsroom when hiring and firing decisions are made? Pointing out the trend to leadership. And then we even offered one example of a successful solution where New York Times copy editors, so newsroom, the copy editors gathered basically after there were some layoffs. And they protested and made a big splash. And so they really got the attention of their staff. The other interesting part about these cards is that it also allows white people in newsrooms to understand more about what the problem is. So in this case, it says, have you noticed folks becoming uncomfortable when race comes up in conversation? Have you ever felt uncomfortable? So these are kind of probing questions, but we wanted to identify a factor that is real that might not be evident in the situation, but allows for self-reflection. In the back of this card, it breaks it down. What is this? Discomfort when talking about race is common among white people. Sometimes when we make a racially insensitive remark, or when race is simply brought up, white people want to move on quickly. That might be a way of avoiding the situation. So why is this a problem? If you were taught to be colorblind, you may not be used to naming and discussing race. Our discomfort can shut down conversations and stop progress. Why is this important? In order to address racism, we need to both gain comfort talking about race and listening to people of color. Only then can we understand the impacts of racism and work towards solutions. And then what can you do? This is like the action step. You can sit with your discomfort. Don't try to avoid it. Take a breath. Move forward by asking questions rather than making statements. So in this card deck, what we really aim to do is to tackle problems on both sides. We didn't think they had to be the same side of the same issue. We really kind of wanted to really speak to addressing some of the concerns of journalists of color, and then also understanding some of the dynamics of what are happening to white people in newsrooms when something offensive may come up, or if there's a newsroom dynamic that is really speaks to power, for instance. We want to kind of unravel that. And so the way we imagine these cards being used is when a situation happens that journalists feel happened in their newsroom, we can stop or have a meeting, and we can kind of pull the card out that's in question as far as the behavior is concerned or the statement is concerned. And then we can have a discussion about what it is that that person experienced or what power play is at hand in this particular moment. So one of the big things about this is it's very scenario-based. So we're still collecting samples of scenarios from journalists of color and white people working in newsrooms. And one great exciting piece of news is that we've been supported by the JSK Fellowship, and so we'll be getting a monetary grant for a year to develop the first round of the prototype. So we imagine you'd be able to come to our website and order and bring those into your newsroom, and then we plan to also host facilitation events in newsrooms where you can actually use the cards. We should totally make pre-ordering be available. All right. So these are the Journalists of Color Survival Kit. And we call it a kit because, just to kind of spin this forward a little bit, we would like to kind of prepare a box or like a set for things that, that might be good in the moment, so like a stress ball or, I don't know, like some kind of vitamins or something. But we're trying to put a nice little kit together. But this is really at the core of the survival kit. So that's why it's been called a survival kit. And I just want to thank the Journalists of Color Slack group. It's a really large Slack group where I asked them to submit answers, and a lot of them did. Our friends and editors at JSK, and also friends and editors that were our colleagues. And I want to thank you for having me speak about these cards. Is there any questions about them? Pre-order? Yeah. All right, I'll get a pre-order form up there. Thank you.